Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to today's event. This is part of a series hosted by the Conservative Friends of Commonwealth with influential conservative thinkers across the globe. I want to point out that a recorded version of this event will be available shortly after the end of this broadcast on a variety of different platforms, including YouTube and Spotify. We have with us today Robert Spalding, who is the author of the groundbreaking book, Stealth War: How China Took Over While America's Elite Slept, a book that we'll be discussing in great detail today. Robert has served in a number of senior positions of strategy and diplomacy within the Defense and State Departments for more than 26 years, and is an accomplished innovator in government and a national security strategist. As Senior Director for Strategy to the President, he was a chief architect of the framework for national competition in the Trump's administration's national security strategy. He's earned recognition for his knowledge of Chinese economic competition, cyber warfare, and political influence, as well as for his ability to forecast global trends and develop innovative solutions. I'd like to start by saying thank you for joining us today, Robert, and how have you been coping in the last few months in these unprecedented times?
Thank you. It's great to be here. I think I've been coping just about as well as anybody has, having to be cooped up for so long. I never thought it would last this long. I think 2 weeks in, I was predicting that, we would go back to work, but so far it's been pretty much locked down. I think it's the same in Europe, I would imagine.
Yeah, I mean, we'll probably come back to COVID-19 a bit later on in this chat. The majority of talk, we will be addressing your incredible book, Stealth War. For those who haven't read it, I thoroughly recommend it. It's a massive eye-opener. You brilliantly demonstrate how China has waged a six-front war on America and the West's economy, military, diplomacy, technology, education, and infrastructure. You also are able to reveal some of China's motives and secrets. And your concern isn't that America could lose its position on the world stage. It's more that the Chinese Communist Party has a fundamental loathing of the legal protections America grants its people and almost seeks to create a world without these rights. Now, I want to take you back to when you lived in China for 2 years, and I've heard you say how much you enjoyed it and how you intended to go back to China actually after your military time was up and start a business and live there. It's fair to say your opinion has somewhat changed. So when was it when you started to ask and answer these questions from the perspective you've obviously come to today?
Well, I was at the Pentagon in 2014. I was the lead China advisor for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. At that time was General Martin Dempsey. And we started working on, at that time, the islands in the South China Sea. Of course, the Obama administration President Obama was in charge of China policy. And one of the things that happened to me the year prior was that I had been a senior fellow, military fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. So I'd met a lot of business and financial and industry leaders. And I was getting information from them at the same time that we were dealing with the islands in the South China Sea. And in particular, I got this one briefing from a gentleman that worked in New York, had invested a lot of money in China, for several years. And the briefing really talked about all kinds of attacks that American companies had come under from China. And as we started digging into it, I realized that, we were focused on the wrong things. We were focused on kind of the military competition, and we had totally disregarded the economic and information competition. And so we went around and we started briefing all the senior leaders in the Department of Defense. And the answer I got back from nearly every 4-star or senior civilian leader was that this is a very bad problem, but it's not our problem. And so, this started a process that, continues for me today, which is trying to uncover the infiltration and influence of the Chinese Communist Party on our society, because it's a competition that, quite frankly, the globalized world hasn't really prepared us for.
One of the fascinating things I've read in your book is it's almost clear how the Chinese Communist Party plans are very well documented. One piece that you mentioned, and I wanted to get a better understanding of, is the 1999 document Unrestricted Warfare, which was produced by the China's People's Liberation Army. For our listeners, could you explain more about the document and the implications for the United States of America and the globe?
Certainly. And in fact, I'm in the process of going through a rewrite of that document to make it more accessible to people. But, it's amazing to read it today. I read it when it came out in 1999. I was a B-2 pilot, and I was fascinated. But at the same time, when I read it in 1999, they were so far ahead of their time in explaining globalization, the internet, in terms of being vectors for attacking the open system, that it just was incomprehensible to me as a warfighter. I was used to the way that the U.S. goes to war, which is completely different than the way that the Chinese Communist Party goes to war. And so when it talks about earthquakes and tidal waves, and there's really bizarre passages in this book, but as we're going through it now, and you look at what they were saying, essentially they were going back to where Clausewitz and Jomini and Duhay and all of the Western theorists on warfare, and just trying to synthesize, why do you go to war? What is the purpose of going to war? And then, based on that purpose, what's the best way, most effectual way to get what you want? And so, they come to the conclusion that you go to war to achieve a national interest. And in an open world, in a globalized, internet-connected world, that the best way to achieve a nation's interests is by utilizing the open system: economics, finance, trade. So instead of being a clear distinction between peacetime and wartime, when you're fighting on the battlefield with weapons, the entire system becomes essentially weaponized, and warfare is waged almost on a continual basis using the tools that the West has created to promote the spread of democracy and wealth and prosperity. So it was when you look at it and you realize, they were predicting things like, the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, and their incredible power, economic power, but also their narrative, their power of the narrative, the ability to use economics and finance in the information system, media, and new media to drive a different sort of interest, not just into China, but also around the world and into our international institutions, and then further into the domestic political institutions of free society. So it's really, really quite brilliant.
One thing that we find very interesting in this country is manufacturing. I'm sure it's similar in the States. When we often talk about people losing their jobs in manufacturing, we often are told and informed that it's largely to the way the world is evolving. With new technologies and robotization, it's only natural that manufacturing jobs will decline. However, your book demonstrates that answer is not totally correct. And I wanted you to just explain how China have played such a huge role in taking jobs away from countries, as you state. One fantastic example is the U.S. trade relationship with China and how they've lost 3.4 million jobs between 2001, which funny enough is when China entered the WTO, and 2017.
Well, it's a kind of perfect storm if you think about it. First of all, when you're talking about manufacturing, and you're trying to create this image of a society that primarily creates wealth through its ideas, then it's intoxicating to say, well, people that do things with their hands in a dirty factory, that's probably better left to other societies that, aren't as advanced and don't have advanced university systems. And so, and then when you couple the fact that you have an environmental protection agency that's hostile to manufacturing, when you have a labor system that's hostile to manufacturing, and you're trying to create this alternative to manufacturing, and you have a corporate sector that realizes they can increase their margins and profitability by offshoring manufacturing, then you really get into this perfect storm where, the Chinese needed to raise the level of earnings and employment in China, and they were more than willing to pollute their environment and more than willing to essentially exploit their labor. These are things that we in the United States were not willing to do. And so, and if you look at today, you have essentially slave labor going on in the Xinjiang region in China, because you have the Uyghurs that are basically forced to work in these concentration camps. And at the same time, you have companies like Apple and Nike that are in Washington, D.C., essentially arguing for the continuation of these policies that allow this behavior to go on. And so when China had, in particular, the party had a problem. It needed to bring its people out of poverty in order to maintain legitimacy. It had a willing partner. The United States was not willing, didn't want to pollute its air and land and water. It didn't want to exploit its labor. And, in addition to that, there was this in academia. So there's corporate side, there's a political side, and then there's academic side, because the economists were saying, no problem. Those people that are displaced, those 5 million people that are displaced from manufacturing, and oh, by the way, each manufacturing job creates 4 supporting jobs in the community where that factory is. All of those jobs, millions of jobs, what's going to happen is they're going to find new jobs in the new economy, in the gig economy, and they're going to be white collar jobs. And of course, in January of 2016, David Autor, MIT labor economist, and a number of other economists released their study called China Shock, which said, okay, that premise, that theoretical economic premise that, academics kind of got on board with the corporate side and the political side, was completely and utterly false. In fact, what had happened is those millions of people never found jobs. And so you had in the United States, in the political side, in the corporate side, in the academic side, near unanimity that this benefited our society. But when you go and you talk to the people of these communities, you find that they're unilaterally, the communities are dying. They're not thriving. And so you have a society where you have this element of the society that's doing quite well, the white collar class and the wealthy. And then you have kind of the middle class and the lower middle class, working class, that are absolutely dying. And not just dying, rhetorically, dying physically, because they're depressed because they don't have employment. And then, oh, by the way, China is pumping fentanyl in the system, and it's finding its way into these societies that are already downtrodden, and a lot of people are dying from opioid addiction, or in the case of fentanyl, it just takes one hit and you're dead. So and that's to the number of probably 50, 60, 70,000 Americans every single year.
It's evident that the complexity that of the stealth war that the Chinese Communist Party has engaged with the West is so huge. Many close observers would find it difficult to understand. We've talked about manufacturing as one of the issues. Going a bit broader, I think a lot of our viewers would almost get an understanding of how you believe the CCP got here. What actually drives them, and what is the model that they use to maintain this authoritarian party. The reason I ask this is because it's clear they have an incredibly long-term plan. So how are they able to maintain this course?
Well, first of all, they're pragmatists. They don't, ideology is not what drives them. Power and wealth is what drives them. And they're pragmatic in terms of how they achieve that. And they study. They spent a long time, and part of that unrestricted warfare document is documenting this understanding that the Soviet Union and kind of the model that came out of this disdain for capitalism and the exploitation of the working class, during the Industrial Revolution, that those models never worked. And in fact, we needed a new model. And so this really doesn't come about in China until Mao Zedong dies and Deng Xiaoping takes over. And he basically says, look, this hasn't worked for us. We've killed tens of millions of people. Obviously, these guys have something. We need to figure out what it is. And so he has this big trip to the United States. He wears a cowboy hat in Texas. He goes to, in addition to speaking to the president, he goes to all the major corporations. Say, come to China, do business in China. We'll make it worth your while. And of course, one point, I don't know, 3 billion or 2 billion Chinese at the time, they see these, they have these fever dreams of profits. And so they do. And so fast forward from, there's the early 70s into 1989, poverty starting to decline, wages are going up. But more importantly, there's this transfer, this cultural transfer going on, as business is happening in China, as Chinese are becoming aware of the way that the West operates, and it's completely different from China. They have these uprisings in the spring and summer of 1989. And the party goes back to Zhongnanhai and begins to have a series of deliberations about, look, what happened in the Soviet Union was that they were weak and they didn't, establish authority over the country. And that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. It led to, poverty in Russia. We can't allow that to happen in China. We have to fix this. And so there's three things that they essentially, come to the conclusion about. One is that the United States is trying to, essentially do a color revolution, just like it was doing in the former Soviet states, using these ideas of democracy and freedom. And so then they were basically putting ideas in the heads of the students that were in Tiananmen Square and elsewhere around the country protesting. We have to put a stop to that. Number two, we have to continue to have access to the capital, the innovation, the technology, the talent from the West, but we cannot allow these ideas of freedom, rule of law, civil liberties, human rights to gain purchase here in our society. And then finally, the party has to be synonymous with the people. If China, the Chinese people, and the Chinese Communist Party are ever seen as distinct things, then we will lose. And so this led to a number of initiatives: forced indoctrination at all grade levels to include university, a strengthening of control over the media. And, this led to, over time, as the internet was born, the Great Firewall. And as they gained the technology and talent, innovation, and capital from the West, they gained the tools of surveillance and control that they have today. So overall, it was just an evolution of the Chinese Communist Party using just pragmatism and the ability to look at their environment, see what was available to them, and take advantage of it in ways that other authoritarian systems just haven't been able to do. You know, I think the Soviet Union was far more ideological in terms of strident commitment to the Marxist-Leninist principles. Now, the Chinese Communist Party for the last 3 decades, you know, before Xi Jinping hasn't really been like that. It was far, and when I lived there from 2002 to 2004, it was like the Wild West of capitalism. But under Xi Jinping, it is back to socialism. The funny thing is that, you know, and this is how, by the way, I came to have this document from this investor in 2014, because he had seen the writing on the wall back then. And I think what happened is all of us missed the signs that, you know, the Chinese Communist Party was never going to adopt the principles of the West. They were going to take all the benefits of a free society, but they were going to strictly ensure that those benefits didn't accrue in terms of the culture and the policies to the Chinese people. But more importantly, because it fears those, it fears objectivity, you know, democracy, rule of law, free trade, all of those things that are kind of the hallmarks of the open system. They fear those because they lose control of the population if they're allowed to have purchase. So not only is it sufficient to suppress those things within China, they have to suppress them everywhere, because Chinese people are leaving China. They're going out around the world and they're being exposed to these. So before they can do that, they have to be thoroughly indoctrinated. Now, the Chinese know that, you know, social media plays a prominent role in modern society. Well, the way that you extend that great firewall is to prevent the social media companies from outside to come into China, so that when your citizens leave, they're all on the social media of Chinese social media, which is essentially curated by the Chinese Communist Party. And so you can use social media as a platform to extend the great firewall into democratic societies, because most Chinese language speakers, when they leave China, stay on WeChat, they stay on Weibo, they don't get on Twitter and Facebook. And through that, there's and what you find is the students, particularly that come over to be in United States universities, they speak Chinese 80-90% of the time. They stay with their Chinese classmates, and they're on Chinese social media. And oh, by the way, when they want to watch TV, all of the Chinese language TV stations in America are controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So, and then all of the print media in Chinese language is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. So in essence, you can live, and because the West has allowed this, you can live in an open society and essentially from an informational perspective, still be living in totalitarian China, because they've basically controlled all the global media for Chinese. Now, the scary thing is that what they intend is that over time, you know, just like Facebook and Google and Twitter and others have been dominant globally in the information economy, they intend for Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent to be dominant in the information economy going forward. And in that case, you know, things like TikTok, you'll be able to not only influence Chinese language speakers, but also English language speakers. So you extend that great firewall, not just to the Chinese language speaking globe, but also the English language speaking globe. And you find proxies in the West that are willing to do that for profit, you know, so you can get all the people out of venture firms in Silicon Valley to be your proxies, as long as you ensure that they're getting rich doing it.
You've touched on a number of things there that we will definitely be looking to go back into. At the start, you mentioned briefly about China's how they've moved so many people out of poverty, and their economic rise is one of the fastest in history, and I don't think no other country has achieved the turn that they have in modern history. How exactly were they able to move so many people out of poverty so quickly?
It's really about capital. So particularly in the United States, there's 40% of the investable capital. The Chinese have been able to use, so it's brilliant, because what they did is they created a closed financial system. Yet, because all of these international corporations wanted to be in China, China has been ushered into, the World Bank and the IMF, International Monetary Fund, in spite of the fact they have a non-convertible currency. And so what you have in China is essentially a currency trap. The money flows in, but it can't flow out because the party controls the money. Every other nation in the world, their currency is traded internationally, I guess, except for maybe like North Korea or some of these other, authoritarian regimes. But certainly they're not, getting $1 billion a year at the World Bank or treated with such deference at the IMF. And so China can rack up these enormous debt levels within China, but they're not exposed to the normal predations that happen when the international financial system realizes, hey, you guys are over leveraged, and people start moving their money out. When that happens, you have a currency devaluation, you have an economic slowdown. None of that happens because they're able to essentially convince the world to allow them to continue to have connection to the international economy and the international financial system, but they don't have to behave like other international systems do. They don't have to behave like the Central Bank of Europe. They don't have to behave like the Fed in the United States. They can behave exactly what they want. And so what they do is, as Chinese companies make hard currency, dollars or euros, they take it back to China. They turn it into the PBOC. The PBOC gives them renminbi that they can then use, but it does at a rate that the PBOC defines. And the PBOC, People's Bank of China, just like the police, just like the border patrol, just like the military, is all controlled by the party. So it basically becomes a funding mechanism for the party. But that capital then that flows into China, it builds cities, it builds roads, it builds all of the infrastructure. And then because now they have an excess of capacity in terms of infrastructure, it goes into the Belt and Road Initiative. So think of this: the World Bank gives China $1 billion a year at very low rates. China can turn around, take that $1 billion, and then loan it back to members of the Belt and Road Initiative at higher rates. So China is actually making money on the World Bank. I mean, that's the kind of system that they've set up, and we've completely allowed it.
As someone who works in finance, I think that the currency manipulation in China is probably one of the most obvious things that you'll see. And something that I definitely agreed with in your book was Steve Bannon's comments on China being a total Ponzi scheme, and how, like you've mentioned there, they keep foreign investment in China, and the dollars invested are kept so they can trade internationally, and the profits remain in non-convertible currencies. But I want to move towards Chinese companies, because a lot of them do tend to be subsidiaries of the CCP, or they tend to be used as piggy banks by the Chinese Communist Party, and they don't follow traditional accounting practices. So it's very hard to assess the health of Chinese companies. And you've seen the Bank of China who eject cash into companies whichever ones they deem important. So with this evidence, you could argue a lot of the West's investment into China is pretty reckless and almost borderline crazy. So why do we continue to invest in China?
Well, that's a very, very simple, there's a simple answer to that. So if you're an investment advisor on Wall Street, and you have, again, 40% of the investable capital, most of it's in institutional investors, which are retirement funds and university endowments in the United States, and they're looking for places to put their money, what you're looking for is a concept called alpha. And that is, what can you as an investment advisor guarantee your clients as a return over and above indexes like the Standard and Poor's 500? Well, it's very difficult to beat the S&P 500. We have full transparency in the West, in the open system, and everybody knows the financial dealings of these companies. They report their earnings. It's all above board. But China is what we call an immature market, right? So it's an immature market in terms of information transparency. Of course, anybody that's been in China knows that every company keeps 3 sets of books. One's for the tax collector, one's for regulators, and the other's for yourself. And so you have literally no transparency in China. And after the financial collapse, 2008, Sarbanes-Oxley, which required, even more stringent reporting by companies, the Obama administration basically gave the Chinese a way out. They were not required to meet those reporting requirements. So we don't have transparency. And so because it's an immature market and there's no transparency, then you as an investment advisor can make alpha. You can find these, what Bill Browder would say is a undervalued company because the market hasn't recognized the value that this company actually has. And so, in other words, the stock multiple for this company in China, being a tech company, has not attained the same stock multiple of this tech company in the West. And therefore, if you applied the same multiple to that stock, well, it's trading at, multiple times below value. And so what they do is they go to CalPERS, the California, public employee retirement system, who has billions of dollars, maybe even $1 trillion. I can't remember the total that they have under management, and says, hey, let's put money here. And so they do. And in fact, what happened over the last couple of years is this is Morgan Stanley Capital International, which is one of these index tracking companies, in its emerging markets index, it started weighting much of the index in Chinese stocks, 20%. It went from 0 to 20%, hundreds of billions of dollars. And so what happens is, when you have a market that hasn't had investors pouring into it, and money starts pouring into that into the tune of tens of billions of dollars a month, the average price of those stocks begins to rise. And so what you've seen over 2020 is an enormous rise in the price of stocks in China, because there's been this constant flow of money into those stocks. And so you're constantly getting more volume. There's more interest in stocks. And so the people that have the stocks, they see the price of the stocks going up. So now the institutional investors, they're happy because, wow, their portfolios are rising 20% this year, where the rest is you may be stagnant. And the investment advisors and Wall Street, they're making tons of money because they're generating alpha, which they get a portion of in their profits. And so everybody's happy. What nobody, and because the Obama administration said, hey, you don't have to actually abide by auditing requirements, the Chinese companies can report whatever they want. And so, we've had companies that, have to go back and say, we reported we had $6 billion in the bank. This actually happened. A company reported it had $6 billion in the bank. And then overnight it said, we don't know what happened to that $6 billion. And that's the way Chinese companies are, because they're not actual companies in the sense that, they have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholder. They have a responsibility to do what the Chinese Communist Party wants. And so, it's unfortunate and it's sad because, when you understand the system, because I get people from these institutional investors calling me and saying, what do we do about this? We're being advised by the professional investors, Goldman Sachs, the JP Morgans of the world. We're being told we have to put our money into China because that's where all the growth is going to come. That's where the profit is going to come. And we owe it to our constituents, the public employees, in this case, the California public employees, that we put the money there, because else they're going to lose out. And furthermore, all the reporting looks great. And you tell them, well, there's no requirement for that reporting to be other than great, because that's the system that the Chinese Communist Party runs. But because we have such a dearth of knowledge about the Chinese Communist Party, about how the system works, about how companies work in that system, there's ignorance. And when you're facing ignorance, if everything looks good, you're not gonna really be, start digging. And it's not. So what's going to happen is, what's inevitably going to happen is this thing's going to come apart at some point, and there's going to be a lot of people wanting to point fingers. And the bottom line is that, we only have ourselves to blame.
One of the interesting things that I found in 2017, you actually mentioned it in your book, was Chinese President Xi Jinping's appearance at Davos. He almost states a lot of things that seem quite contradictory to the book and general Chinese criticism, where he says, we must remain committed to developing global free trade investment, promote trade and investment, liberalization and facilitation through opening up and saying no to protectionism. Now, that sounds a lot like he's adopting the Western point of view, yet his actions may say otherwise. What do you think the message is here from Xi, and what are the CCP intentions here?
Well, look at the people that he's talking to there at Davos. It's not the working class. Every one of them have been getting wealthy. Look at, oh, by the way, how much has Jeff Bezos made during just the coronavirus alone? We've had massive unemployment. We've had over 20% of small businesses in the United States close. We've had over 40% of Black-owned businesses in the United States close. But you've had the biggest companies in America, Walmart, Amazon, make fantastic profits. What does the coronavirus require? Facebook, or not Facebook, but Amazon it's doing gangbusters in business. Walmart has to stay open. But most of these small shops have to close. So it's been what you have in this economy at Davos is all of the wealthy elites that are getting richer, and they're in essence, there's this mind meld. There's this view that the world that the elites want and the world that the Chinese Communist Party leadership wants is this one, globalized world where where essentially, everybody's a consumer, and these people continue to get wealthy. And the thing that's sacrificed is really economic opportunity. So economic opportunity, which used to be the hallmark of the West. There's two things that we've been able to achieve, prior to the end of the Cold War, and even I would say in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War. One was equality under the law. So, in the United States, we went through the labor movement, we went through the civil rights movement. So there was a lot of work. There was the environmental movement, and so there was a lot of rules and laws put in place to create this system that wasn't perfect in the beginning, but eventually led to equality under the law. The other thing that you had was economic opportunity, access to capital for small businesses. All of that has gone away, and it's been accelerated by the coronavirus. But in essence, the thing, if you look at 2020 as just a microcosm of the post-Cold War order, you've seen a decline in the available of economic opportunity in the West, particularly to those that are disadvantaged. And that economic opportunity has flown to the people of China because the Chinese Communist Party saw that if they could inject capital into their society, that you would, eventually winners would rise to the top, and then you could inject more capital in that. But you needed to have capital in the society for economic growth to happen. And as long as we're in this, what Xi would call, and what he would say at Davos is this complementary or collaborative or whatever you want to call it situation where capital from the West can flow to China, and China can direct that capital in ways that benefits its people, so that the Communist Party can stay in charge. Then we continue to have the situation that we're in, and the people that are benefiting from this are the people that meet Xi Jinping at Davos and every other economic forum.
One thing, talking of sort of elites and Western issues that we're facing is 5G. It's a very contentious subject in the UK, and in your book you talk about the risks that 5G networks being built by Chinese telecom providers. And I know you drafted a proposal on managing of 5G networks, which I'm keen to hear more about. How just yesterday it was confirmed by the Conservative government here in the UK that telecom providers must stop installing Huawei equipment in the UK's 5G mobile network from September, with the official law being announced tomorrow, which bans the Chinese firm from the networks. Do you think US should adopt a similar ban?
Well, they already have. They've already banned it, and in fact, the FCC has instituted rip and replace for a lot of the rural operators that have Huawei equipment. But of course, rural operators don't want to shut off their service because then they have to stop it. So they don't really want to do rip and replace. The reason Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google rose to prominence from kind of 2007 to 2018, that decade, the iPhone comes out in 2007. The reason those companies became 25% of the Standard & Poor's 500 is because they were able to mine, tremendous amounts of data about the users of the iPhone and Android phones. So Android and iOS really became the platforms for that information economy. But that's not the world of 5G. So your phone, I don't know if you have an iPhone or an Android phone. If you have an Android phone, it's sending stuff back to Google. Whether or not you have Google services, it's sending stuff back to Google 70 times an hour. On even on an iPhone, your Facebook app and other apps are sending data back according to the things that you services you sign up for. You get in an Uber, all your data is sent. Your phone collects all kinds of information about you. It has accelerometers, it has microphones, it has cameras, it has all of this instrumentation, like telemetry on a rocket. And all this telemetry is being, GPS is being collected about you every second of every day. And that telemetry is then going to help feed algorithms, like for instance, in the app TikTok, that allow the ByteDance, which is kind of the AI company behind TikTok, to really understand sentiment, understand the things that you like. So what the Chinese recognize is that in order to begin to influence its own society, it needed to have control over that process. Well, it couldn't break into the smartphone industry because Android and iOS own such a dominant share of the computing platform. And so, 5G really gives it that opportunity. And the reason is because 5G is not about the smartphone, it's about the smart city. So in essence, your smartphone really no longer plays a role or as dominant a role in the telemetry that's gathered about you. It's the city that gathers things. So, Beijing, 2 cameras for every person. So cameras, microphones, all of these sensors that exist around the city to monitor what everything's doing. And that's data is turned into sentiment analysis. And then in the Chinese system, it's turned into influence. And so like the social credit score, it's watching, do you smoke? Do you drink? Do you jaywalk? Do you have bad friends? Do you curse the government? Do you pay your bills on time? Do you behave as a citizen like the Chinese Communist Party wants you to behave, or do you behave in another manner? And if you behave in another manner, then essentially you're given a scarlet letter and your access to services, goods and services is taken away. So what the Chinese seek to do is basically take this model and export it by dominating the smart city. Now, the way that Facebook, Amazon, and Google dominated the smartphone environment is because the United States was the first, is the second country to build out a 4G network. 3G didn't work with smartphones. You needed 4G. And of course, it was, the origin of iOS and Android. And so it really gave American companies a leg up in terms of building the apps, services, and business models of the information economy. What the Chinese are doing right now, and they were doing it in 2017 when I was a defense attaché in Beijing, is building those apps, services, and business models, not of the smartphone world, of the smart city world. I give the example all the time where you could order, and this is 2017, I could order food on my phone. I could put my phone away, walk into a restaurant, and the camera would do facial recognition, and the greeter would hand me my food and greet me by name. This is the elements of 4G and 5G world kind of mixed together. 5G really just gets rid of that intermediary of the phone. I don't need to say, hey, I'd like some pork fried rice in my phone, or push a button. I can just say, hey, I'd like some pork fried rice from this restaurant. Camera picks up my voice, and they have cameras or microphone picks up my voice, camera does facial recognition, all that data gets sent to that restaurant. They make the food, I go in, they hand me my food. I raise my hand, I say I want an Uber shows up. All of these things are built into the 5G world. The platform, rather than being the smart device, which does all the computing. So all of these, computing chips that Apple and Android and others use to run their devices, actually, that computing is now in the network itself. So this is called edge computing. It's basically taking all of those cloud servers that are, in central data centers, and they're moving them closer to where the actual work is happening. So in this case, it'd be very close to wherever the 5G radios are. And as that data comes in, it's processed very quickly. And then that's turned into, in essence, the equivalent of a virtual button push today in the 4G world. So, think of it. What a wonderful, convenient way to live your life. You don't need a smartphone anymore. You can just, it's there. You get into a cab, for example, or an Uber, and there's a screen on the back of the seat in front of you, and that screen becomes your screen. It recognizes you, it interacts with you, shows you things that you want to see, and then the next person gets in and does the same thing. All that's driven by the edge compute that's happening on the network. This is the world that China is building in China now, and what it sought to build with 5G. The only problem is that, and this is one I've been very critical of the U.S. government about, is that it's not sufficient to get rid of Huawei, because Huawei and ZTE and every other Chinese telecom company, China Unicom, China Mobile, they're all at the standards making body 3GPP, along with Qualcomm, along with Ericsson, along with Intel. And guess who's dominating the standards and the technology for 5G? China is. So when you get a network built that's built according to the standards of the industry today, they are basically Chinese standards. So it doesn't matter if it's Huawei or Ericsson, it's still being built according to the same standards. And those standards are built according to the Chinese Communist Party's goals, which are massive collection of data. You go read AI Superpower by Kai-Fu Lee. Watch some of his videos. What Kai-Fu Lee says is that China's goal is to become the Saudi Arabia of data. They want to collect everybody's data because data is what drives the algorithms and artificial intelligence that enables them to do what they want to do. So what makes TikTok so good is the data that it vacuums up from users, and then that feeds that to ByteDance to improve the AI and sentiment analysis. This is the same thing that there's a good report from Australian Strategic Policy Institute, Engineering Global Consent, that talks about Global Tone Communication Corporation, does the same thing, collects 2 to 3 petabytes of data, doing machine language translation in 65 languages around the world. A lot of their products, software products, are in Huawei products. That data goes to the Chinese Communist Party, so the United Front Work Group, and it goes to the People's Liberation Army intelligence arm. So all of this data is going to feed the Chinese state, and it doesn't matter who's So the problem we have here, and the problem that I identified in the paper that I wrote when I was at the White House, is we needed a secure 5G, not just 5G. We needed to have an internet that encrypted user data, that ensured that your data was only viewable by you or by those that had your consent. And so as opposed to the data model that we have today, which is the same data model that existed when ARPANET came into being, when the internet was formed, this open data model where data can be easily copied and shared and basically stolen. What we needed to have is data that was encrypted across the entire system, at least for the United States is what I was saying. And then you work with allies and partners to do the same, because in a democracy, what you find in the 21st century in our globalized internet connected world, in order to promote and preserve the principles of democracy in that world, that people had to own their data, because if they didn't own their data, they didn't really understand the separation of power from the state, from the corporation, and the individual. And in fact, I make this point, the Second Amendment in the United States was, originally designed to protect the populace from an oppressive government by giving them the means to resist. But what you find in the 21st century is that oppression is subtle and it's imperceptible. And then so in fact, because the narrative is designed to, it's based on information that's been collected about you as an individual and knows what you like, what you don't like. And then it slowly seeks to change your perception of what you want, that this now has gone past this idea of if you had a weapon, you could ensure your independence, because your independence is essentially subtly maneuvered by these corporations, and in the case of China, by this nation state. And it's done because this data about you that should be your own, this data that should be private, is collected and then run through these large data companies to create algorithms that are meant to influence you. And so, the way that you protect that, if you don't know who's the oppressor, or you don't know that you're even being oppressed because the system is designed to prevent you from perceiving that, then this idea of a gun being, protecting, the citizenry from an oppressive government, or in this case, oppressive companies like Facebook, Amazon, and Google, then you've surpassed the way our ability to govern, using the documents like in the United States, the Constitution, and so the need to encrypt that data to ensure that the citizenry has control of that data, and only allows it to be used in ways that they actually find consistent with their own privacy and security, then you have, the kind of system that you need. We're not building that. That's one of the reasons I left government, because I realized that, government was interested in protecting its own data, but it wasn't interested in protecting the data of citizens, because a lot of those tech companies were lobbying DC to allow them to continue to collect data and sell data and really make your intent be kind of the design of the system. And so, I wanted to get out and start working in this area of how do we create these networks that are secure and encrypted and prevent our data from being harvested, because absent that, there's no way. Think about it. How do you preserve a democracy in the UK? How do you preserve a democracy in America when you actually no longer have control of the narrative as a government, which was designed to have separation of powers? But because corporations, and in particular the Chinese Communist Party, they've gained so much power in controlling the narrative that you can no longer protect the populace from undue influence from outside. That's why militaries were created, was to protect a free society from coercion. But today it goes right into your living room. It goes right into your phone, and it's disintermediated the ability of the government to protect the populace from that. And in fact, the political system, because of all the money coming from the elites that are making money off through this process, has itself been corrupted. And so the narratives you see, and this is your point about Davos, you see the narratives beginning to come into alignment between the authoritarian regimes, particularly China, and the democracies, and you see that poignantly. You see it in stark relief during the coronavirus, because here you have the country that spread the virus actually being noted in all Western media as the country most effective at dealing with the virus by instituting totalitarian measures that is then adopted and repeated in democracies. It is, and you can't talk about these things because people think that you're kooky.
We've got a number of COVID questions. I can't wait to get your thoughts on. But one of the interesting things you mentioned there is about the role of government. And in the book, you mention how both Democrats and Republicans are at fault for allowing China to infiltrate USA the way they have. And throughout the book, there are some really big names that many of our audience will be aware of. However, one you could argue a particular concern was Joe Biden. His son, Hunter Biden, teamed up with Bank of America to create a $1 billion investment fund, $1 billion investment fund. And he flew in 2013 with his father to China, where the vice president had meetings at the time with CCP leaders. And I think it was 10 days after the trip, the deal for a $1 billion in funds was backed by the Chinese government. Now, looking at the optics, it's a bit disturbing. And, there's so many things of potential bribery, elite privilege. I think in the BBC we reported the misuse of Air Force Two. So I want to ask you how they were almost able to get away with that, and why there wasn't as much scrutiny on this back in 2013. Because we've seen a lot more scrutiny in recent times for a lot less. So I find it fascinating that this didn't receive as much attention.
Well, I mean, they have been able to get away with it. I mean, clearly, you see the press would not talk about Hunter Biden at all during the campaign. So they have been able to get away with it. And I bring up Mitch McConnell and his wife Elaine Chao as well. So it doesn't matter if you're on the right or the left. Look, our political process, the same things happen in the UK, I guarantee it, in France and every other democracy around the world. People are getting paid. Now, are politicians getting directly paid? No, most likely it's their family members. Most likely it's a company that they own stock in that's benefiting from a relationship with China. It's not something that you can see, oh, this is a direct quid pro quo. Certainly there's those things that happen, but all the Chinese are trying to do is create this common narrative that supports their view of the world, and that is just keep things tapping along, and we'll figure out ways to take advantage of it. What we don't want to do, look, we don't want tariffs. We don't want you to stop sending money to China. We don't want you to. We don't want this decoupling. Heaven forbid. No, we need to stay coupled to your societies. And even like, U.S. government, FBI director. Well, we don't want to completely decouple with China. The Department of Justice, we don't want to completely decouple with China. This is the mantra. We don't want to completely decouple, maybe a little bit of decoupling, but we don't want to completely decouple because that would be bad for our economy. Where is that message coming from? It's coming from our own companies and our own corporations who are basically put under pressure by the Chinese Communist Party to say these things. So, it's funny. People say Apple is an American company. Nike is an American company. I just told you that Apple and Nike are essentially lobbying Congress to keep, the ability to have slave labor in Xinjiang. Now, the last I checked, America didn't believe in slave labor. We didn't believe in oppression, but our corporations, which are American corporations, certainly do. Why? Because, we've disconnected the principles of the West from the profit of the West. What the Chinese did is they connected the principles of China to the profit of China and the profit of everybody else. And so when you realize that warfare is really about influence, and this is a way Mao viewed warfare. He called it people's war. And it was really about undermining the faith and confidence of the people in the governing systems. This is exactly what's going on. And so, the idea is that there's this one way of thinking of the world, and you don't do the thinking as a citizen. The government and the corporations do the thinking for you, and those rules are then given to you. And as long as you abide by those rules, you're going to do fantastic. As soon as you stop abiding by those rules, you're going to have problems. And so that's where we're at. And so whether it's on the right or the left, everybody is in some way incentivized by the system.
One of the fascinating things is a number of we've had a number of questions on Biden. One being, you mentioned how he was almost a cheerleader for China for decades. How do you expect a Biden administration to deal with China, if at all? And what sort of relationship do you envisage them having?
Well, so part of the thing that's happened over the last 4 years because of the president's willingness to confront China has been this more aggressive posture on behalf of China. And clearly the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping has decided to decouple. And they've done that in a way that preferences Chinese companies and essentially creates problems for other companies that are outside China. But still, they want to continue to take as much as they can. So Biden is going to be constrained by the political process in the United States to the extent that it continues to see China for what it is. My fear is not an aggressive China. It's not an aggressive Chinese Communist Party. That's actually what I want. I want them to actually be who they are. My fear is a Chinese Communist Party that begins to go back to Deng Xiaoping. So I love Xi Jinping. I think he's the greatest thing since sliced bread because he actually is more communist than the communist. He actually fervently believes in socialism. He believes in the rhetoric. And so he's very bad in a sense strategically for the method of warfare that they want to engage in. But I'm constantly afraid that they're going to get rid of him and we'll have somebody more like Deng Xiaoping that recognizes, and there are those people, Liu He is one of those people that would recognize, look, guys, we can't push the West right now. Let's keep tapping them along and we'll eventually get there. Xi Jinping doesn't want to do that. That's why they tore up the trade deal with that Lighthizer and Liu He had negotiated, because They were not going to reform their system. In all they needed to do was basically say they were going to do it and at least institute some of the reforms. And then you would have seen this great, relaxation. President Trump would have declared victory. We would have been right back in the mess where, everybody's trusting Chinese firms. And, thankfully we're not there. But I do think that as long as Xi Jinping continues to act aggressive, I think, look what's going on with Australia right now. They're basically saying, the Australians, you either get down on your knees or we're going to break you economically. That's what Xi Jinping is saying. And I don't know if you saw the tweet that Zhao Lijian sent out with an Australian soldier kneeling over the top of an Afghani girl holding a lamb with a knife to her throat. I mean, this is the level that the Chinese Communist Party under Xi Jinping is willing to go to. That kind of country, under that kind of leader, I think we can deal with, because it's very clear, it's in your face. The Deng Xiaoping kind of faction, the way that Chao Liang, which is one of the authors of Unrestricted Warfare, that type of thinking we can't deal with, because it is if people come at it with kindness, we want to reciprocate, and we think it's genuine, and their kindness is not genuine.
I've brought in our projects manager, Phoebe Sullivan, who has a question for you.
Good afternoon. Firstly, thank you for providing so much insight about the CCP. I wanted to briefly discuss national security strategies. There are some who say that the NSS in general will become obsolete. To what extent do you think the coronavirus pandemic has impacted the relevance of NSS in the long term?
Well, I mean, I think the national security strategy, if it's implemented, is great, and it's designed to deal with the China as it is, not as we wish it would be. And there's kind of three elements to this: protect, rebuild, and inspire. So the protect is really about decoupling, to stop the flow of innovation, technology, talent, and capital into China, and to really separate their society, which is a totalitarian society, and their institutions, which are totalitarian institutions, from our democracy and the democracy of our allies and partners, to the extent that they agree. So we call that forging a new consensus. And in fact, diplomatically, that's what the State Department and the National Security Council or staff has been trying to do: talk to our allies and partners and come to a shared understanding on a new consensus. Western consensus is dead. We have a lot of new democracies that have formed since the Western consensus. And more importantly, we've gotten away from promoting the values and principles of democracy and free trade. And so work with allies and partners on a bilateral basis to achieve that. That's really protect. Rebuild is then take that innovation, technology, talent, and capital that's been flowing to China and on behalf of China, and reinvest it in our own societies. So rebuild infrastructure and manufacturing, science and technology in the United States, also in the UK and other allies and partners. So then we see the economic opportunity of the working class in those societies begin to take hold. The economies begin to grow, because we're not growing China's economy, we're growing our own. And then in Inspire, it's really taking that excess capacity, just like during the Marshall Plan, identifying strategic partners in emerging market economies in regions like Africa and Latin America and Southeast Asia, and helping them grow not only their economies in a more comprehensive way than we've been using in the United States: USAID, the Developmental Finance Corporation, Millennium Challenge Corporation, the Trade Development Agency, all of these, Export-Import Bank, all of these institutions of the West, in conjunction with things like the Japan International Bank of Cooperation and other developmental finance organizations of allies and partners, and begin to create not just economic opportunity in emerging markets, but also the structure of democratic institutions. And you have to do that in a much better way, more like the Marshall Plan than developmental finance has been executed since the end of the Cold War, which has not been tied to any kind of strategy. I went to USAID in 2017. I said, "What's your strategy?" And they looked at me like I had horns coming out of my head. We have to actually so it's really a strategy of building, not breaking. We've had, since the end of the Cold War, a strategy of breaking. We'd fought wars all over the world. We thought we were making the world safe for democracy. And in fact, what the Chinese were doing, were coming in behind us while we spent all that money and actually taking advantage of the opportunities that were available in those societies to create economic opportunity, but also create institutions and in particular elites that supported the Chinese methodology. So protect, rebuild, inspire. If we do those things, if we do those collectively as democracies and we work together to strengthen our democratic ties, then we push out the authoritarians. If we rebuild our economies and our societies, and then we use that excess to help rebuild the emerging market economies, then you create the same kind of momentum that we had during the Cold War. It's a different kind of a war because it's less a war about nukes and oil. It's more a world about data. It's more a world about artificial intelligence and technology. And so it's a different kind of a Cold War, but it's a Cold War nevertheless, because if we allow them in, then we are no longer able to protect the citizens from being kind of taken out, in a different direction.
Thank you.
We also have with us one of our main sort of advisors for the Conservative Friends of Commonwealth, Samuel Ennis, who has a question.
Professor Spalding, nice to meet you. So 2 questions. The first question is, you made a very good point about the rise of China. How can the UK become more competitive and more influential on the global stage? And then secondly, what is it like to work with Donald Trump?
So first of all, I think, the UK has, its institutions still in place. I think, the things that I would recommend is basically begin to strengthen its ties. I know that the US and the UK have talked about a free trade agreement. Figure out how it strengthens those economic and financial and informational ties with democracies. Push off the Chinese, take capital, inject it into the society, grow your manufacturing base back, begin to actually have a productive economy. And then, I think you're going to see as a result that attractiveness, and it'll be the attractiveness of the British currency. It'll be attractiveness of the British economy. That's where I think you're going to begin to have traction in terms of on the international stage. I think what's happened is London's been, trying too hard to ally itself with Beijing, and Beijing really cares about Beijing. They don't care about London, and so they're just using London as a proxy. Fix that. In terms of working in the Trump administration, the job for me, I don't even have a picture, to be honest, of being at the White House. I spent all my time just thinking about how do we get out of the situation we're in. So I never had a chance to appreciate being there. It was like I go there every single day, and the truth of the matter was there was a significant portion of my time that I expected at any given day I would be fired, because it was the political system within the administration was one of which the establishment was trying to push out any that supported kind of the policies of the president. And it's really not really policies, but it's the thinking. It's how do you think differently about our society? One of the things that President Trump was able to do is break out of the groupthink that's in Washington, D.C. I think 95% of Washington, D.C. voted for Biden. So you have this basically echo chamber within Washington, D.C. Anybody that's involved in national security policy or foreign policy essentially grows up in the system, and this was my problem as well. And it wasn't until I was able to be confronted with an alternative point of view and then use that to go on this process of discovery that I was able to take a step back and say, wait a second, why are we doing these things? That does not happen in DC, because whether you're in the Democratic Party, the Republican Party, both sides agree on kind of the status quo. And so in the administration, what the administration was doing was, you had a president that was questioning the status quo, but then everybody else that was in the system had been a product of that status quo. And so when they looked around, they said, who are our enemies? Our enemies are people that agree with what the president's saying, because they're challenging the convention. They're challenging the status quo. They're saying, wait, maybe this guy has a point. Maybe we shouldn't spend $40 billion a year in Afghanistan. Maybe we should spend that instead on sending American kids through STEM degree programs like we did during the Cold War. This is, so, you know, I didn't get to, it wasn't like I was having fun. I literally did it on behalf of the nation, and with no expectation that, number one, I wouldn't be fired. Eventually I was. Number two, that, you know, I'd ever have a job again, because eventually it's kind of like Billy Mitchell, you know, he goes in and he says, hey, something's not right here. We need to fix it. When you do that, you kind of, you create a very difficult place for yourself to be a part of the system going forward.
Okay, well done anyway.
We've had, unsurprisingly, a number of questions on COVID-19. How much do you blame the CCP for the situation we're in right now with regards to COVID-19? You know, there's a number of studies that suggest, you know, the CCP had the potential to stop 95% of the outbreak, and they should have acted quicker, which leads me to the second part of the question is, are they being held accountable? Because it seems every day we have you know, an outpour of people ready to criticize every government official in every country, time to deal with something so unprecedented and unique, yet there seems to be very little coverage on how we almost got it and holding these people accountable.
100%. The 100% accountability for the Chinese Communist Party. They spread it. You know, again, I'm not talking about did they make it in a lab? Was it accidentally released, or did it come naturally? That's all irrelevant. They enabled the spread of it. More importantly, their information and disinformation and influence campaign that has gone right alongside of it has perpetuated the lockdowns. So think about what I said. We're trying to destroy the working class, right? The way that you do that is take away economic opportunity. What better way to take away economic opportunity by forcing them to close their businesses, right? Because of the coronavirus. So we restrict people, we force them to close their businesses. Meanwhile, all of the PPE and masks come from China. So China's economy was going like this, you know, into the coronavirus. Now it's gone like this. Everybody else is, you know, kind of flatline or stagnant. In the United States, the president just said, hey, great, we just made 30,000 on the stock market. Okay. At the same time, though, if you look at the country, most of the country hasn't made their rent or mortgage payments in 2 to 3 months, right? So we're on the precipice of a economic disaster worse than 2008, yet our stock market looks like everything's running great. Why? Amazon's doing good, Facebook, you know, Walmart's doing good, but all of these small businesses are not doing well. And so, you know, there's this idea of a universal basic income. So we're gonna pay these people because they're suffering. You know, again, it reinforces this idea of socialism. We're creating it as part of our economic dislocation. And so, in essence, when I wrote the book, I said we got about 3 years, and then we started in 2018 to begin to implement tariffs and really protect the society and work with our allies and partners to recognize the threat. And then 2020 coronavirus. Now, was that deliberately meant to stop? You know, the Chinese Communist Party is pragmatic. They're opportunistic. I think they saw an opportunity. They took it. We took it hook, line, and sinker. There's a report that just looked at deaths in America. You know, in terms of statistics, deaths in America aren't any higher than any other year, except that the category for heart disease has dropped precipitously and it's been replaced by coronavirus. So people are dying about the same rates as they've been dying. We're just calling it coronavirus. And then as a result, we're creating economic devastation because all of these states and communities are locking down. These businesses can't work. The people are going bankrupt. Amazon and Facebook get richer. The working class get poorer. It is an economic catastrophe, the likes of which the world has never seen. And it's the fastest, I think, descent into socialism and eventually communism that we've seen. And it just, you know, we talk about the power of nuclear weapons, the power that Silicon Valley built in the controlling the narrative, and they do control the narrative. That's what China recognized. That's where the Great Firewall comes from. That's their vast, effort to control data and artificial intelligence. It has given them such enormous influence in our societies. And you're right. The politicians are criticized because they haven't, addressed the coronavirus to the same, creditable way that the Chinese Communist Party has. And you're looking at, and I'm looking at it like these guys spread it and they're getting made to be the guys that are taking care of the population. And in fact, there's a couple of different, studies showing that the whole thing is done to basically convince people to stay indoors and basically accept the fact that the governments are here to dictate what they do. I'm amazed. You walk around outside in the United States, people are wearing masks outside, and they're basically willingly, a lot of them willingly just saying, well, I'm just gonna close my business because I can't make any business. I don't know what I'm gonna do. But I'm surprised that we haven't had more of a revolution. And I think part of that was maybe people thought that they could do it in the vote. And then we had these massive mail-in ballots, unbelievable. People were, so Pennsylvania, 1.8 million ballots were sent out, 2.5 million were returned in mail-in ballots. So I think you're going to see a lot of agitation in the population going forward because there's a recognition that things are just accelerating in the wrong direction.
I wanted to, talking of COVID and there's a number of different reports here, and probably something that I potentially agree with is that, if it wasn't for COVID-19, Trump potentially wins the election quite handsomely. Is that something that you agree with? And also, how do you think going forward, if Biden does become president, he'll be handling the sort of China and more pressingly the COVID situation?
Well, I don't think it's about Trump anymore. I actually think it's more about, will we allow this unnatural situation with the coronavirus to continue? If we do, if we allow voting to continue the way it has. Look, I mean, most of the people, I think most of the people on the Republican side, and I don't consider myself to be Republican or Democrat, I'm more of a libertarian, but most of the people on the Republican side say, you got us, you won. Good one. We'll get you next time. That's what they're saying. I'm horrified because we're basically accepting that the election was horribly flawed. There was enormous fraud. It was the reason we had enormous fraud. The argument that was made that these massive mail-in ballots were allowed was because of the coronavirus. If we don't change, right? If we don't have voting security in the United States, it doesn't matter if Trump wins this election or not. We're not going to be a democracy. So think about this. If this persists, this willingness on the part of the citizens in free societies to basically forego freedoms, in spite of statistical evidence, scientific, proof that no more people are dying than in any other year they're just dying from something different, then, I guess we deserve what we get, because ultimately it's our decision to essentially succumb to this, and then, look, I've studied the Chinese. Their system really works because they took a systems engineering approach to social control, right? How do we get feedback from the system? How do we reinforce the kind of behavior we want? It's about tying the greed and fear. You tie greed and fear to what we want, and we can do that by using these tools that the West created. These computing and networking systems that allows us to take data and really turn it into ways that promote the narrative of the ruling class. And so it is it's a world very much designed for totalitarian control. If you go back to the book 1984, you're like, well, this is science fiction. This could never happen. Well, it's happened, and we built it. The West built it, not totalitarians. People, with good intention built this thing to, basically in their minds make the world better. And in reality, they unleash this very, very powerful weapon. And now it's in the hands of folks that really don't care about democracy. They really care about power and control and wealth. And they have the tools to implement that. And I think it's very, very difficult for us to break out of that cycle. I don't see how in China, like if you're living in China, you talk to a Chinese person, what they'll tell you is essentially what the Communist Party wants you to hear. Now, is it because that they just came to that on their own? Or is it the years of schooling they've had and the reinforcement from the media and social media? Well, I tend to believe the latter. And I tend to believe that in a modern society, you can continue to perpetuate that. How do you break out of that cycle? Look, if a person is perfectly content to be in their system, even though they know that, hey, there's some places I cannot go. There are some things I cannot say. There are some things I cannot do. We're not talking about murder or thievery. I cannot challenge the ruling political party or the political system. Then but if I do all these other things, fine, it's okay. If you go back to the movie The Matrix, because now as the more I see this, the more I see what The Matrix was really saying. And you get the guy that it turns out to be the guy that's betraying Neo, and he just wants to be put back in the Matrix. Just put me back. I don't care that I'm getting fed through his tube. It tastes like a steak. It's fine. This is a world that has been created for us, and this is what we're adopting. And so I don't like it. I want my kids to have a choice. I want their kids to have a choice. But there's only so much that you can do. You have to stand up and fight. And if we as a society, and I'm not saying just America, but as a global, society of free people, if we're not willing to stand up and fight for freedom, then it's gonna be taken away from us, and we deserve to have it taken away because we were willing to release it.
It's interesting. You mentioned Matrix. I saw the other day actually that the Matrix 4 is coming out next year. But you've mentioned your kids, and you've mentioned about the future. And in your book, you've put a call of action timeline to 3 years to essentially reverse the course of the CCP. And I know you've recently said that, and even in this interview, you said you want to that timeline is extended somewhat because of some of the stuff that the Trump administration has done. What do you think needs to happen in the coming years? Because my question is, how do you protect a lot of these institutions who claim there isn't a threat? And there's clearly a financial incentive for the richest and most famous to almost side with our enemies over our own citizens. So, what do you think needs to happen?
Yeah, I think economic opportunity is the biggest challenge we have right now, and it's getting that economic opportunity to the working class and the middle class. And if we can do that, And if we can do the things like protect, rebuild, and inspire that it's in the national security strategy, we're going to be fine. If we protect our data, if we secure it, I think we'll be fine. If we don't do that, if we continue to have this separation of economic opportunity from, the Bezos of the world, from the people that live in, small towns in Pennsylvania, then, we're going to descend into this morass. And I really don't see a way out, because the power of the tech companies is just so overwhelming, and they'll be replaced by the Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencents of the world, that have a completely, it's not just that they don't care about democratic principles, it's that they actually seek to destroy them. And so we're in a big, and so I did say that we're down to 3 years, and I did say that that Trump was giving us space, but what I've seen is that coronavirus has smashed it. So the Chinese Communist Party have been effective in employing coronavirus as a means to thwart what Trump built. In just a year, they've been able to basically not only stop, but absolutely reverse, and in some cases move forward the cause of authoritarianism. And they're being praised by the Western media for doing so. And so, look, I remain very, very pessimistic. I don't think the political process can be healed. I think we have to take a step back. We have to heal our cultural system, our social system. We have to understand that, these principles and values that led to, the revolution in the United States, and really the birth of democracy, and then got us through the 2 world wars and the Cold War. If we don't embrace those principles, then I think the political process is just, I think it's implementing, solidifying what's already kind of the trend that's in place. So I hate to be a downer or pessimistic, but I think most people that are in politics, and I'm not in politics, but I am a close observer from my perch here in Washington, D.C. These people they're not deterred in any sense of the word, and they're entitled. They believe that they have the right answers, and that the rest of America, in our case, doesn't. And not only do they not have the right answers, they're fascists or racist or somehow just less of a human, because they think that there's something wrong with the way our system works. And I think we're going to have to fight that. And if we don't fight it, and I dare say, looking at Europe, I don't know what your opinion is, but I feel like the same types of things are going on there, where people are just, they're fed up. They don't want it anymore. They don't want the way the system's working. It's not working for them, and they're afraid.
You're leading on perfectly to the final question, and it's safe to say in UK and a lot of European countries that there is an anti-establishment issue, and it's been going on for a number of years, and in some cases, it's hard to argue against it. That said, going forward, what advice would you be giving to the UK government and generally other Commonwealth countries with regards to dealing with China and almost COVID going forward?
Yeah, I would decouple from China and start investing in infrastructure and manufacturing and STEM education, science and technology. Aggressively go after and eliminate this idea of critical race theory and social justice and applied postmodernism in universities, because in many ways it's a return to the pre-Enlightenment period, where rational thought and objectivity and individuality was basically, that came out of that. And same things happen in the United States. It is, by the way, the same process of indoctrination that is occurring in China. So, critical race theory, social justice theory, anything that says that that science or objective truth is not attainable. It is only a figment of whoever the ruling class is. In other words, this sense that truth is only, only certain people have the truth, and therefore those are the people that you have to listen to about the truth. This is very damaging. So when you put all these things, when you go for economic opportunity, when you smash these ideas of critical race theory and applied postmodernism, then I think that you're well on your way to healing what ails us.
With the critical race theory and social injustice, it's something that's very prominent in the UK as well. And one of the sort of criticism, if you like, or if you almost argue against it, a lot of people are tainted with the word, racist, or you're if you're similar, the same, an ethnic minority, a sellout, or whatever term you want to use. How do you combat against that? Because it seems very harder and harder in terms of 2020 to say a lot of the stuff that you're saying.
Well, first of all, what I would note is that the Chinese Communist Party does the same thing, right? If you criticize them, they say, well, you're a racist. You're a racist against Chinese. I highly recommend the book Cynical Theories. James Lindsay and Helen Puckrose, I think, do a very good job of outlining applied postmodernism and critical race theory, and detailing why it's actually racist, why it's actually more of a religion than a science. What the humanities in the United States and elsewhere want to convince you of is that these are scientific methodologies for understanding inequality in a society, and it's not true. There's no science behind it. It is all about controlling the narrative in the same way the Chinese Communist Party does. And so, recognizing who's behind this, the philosophers behind it, the activists behind it, what they seek to achieve, which is not equality under the law. They seek inequality, right? They seek to, through intersectionalism, to basically say that, if you are a, traditionally aggrieved class, the more aggrieved you are. In other words, if you have a number of these things, if you're gay or transsexual, and you're a minority, and you're a female, well, now that is you need to be elevated to the top, and then we should all listen to you, because in reality, any society is the power is based on who's ever at the top. And so what we need to do is take all these that were once at the bottom, put up at the top, and everything will be fine. No, because there's always going to be other levels of, so the transsexual Black, female that's at the top, well, they're going to be over the top of the white male, homosexual. That they're going to have more power in that system. And that's the way critical race theory works. That's the way social justice works. It's not about elevating humanity. It's not about we're all equal. It's really about some are more equal than others. So you get into this basically Animal Farm 1984 system where it is literally a religion, and it's the same religion that the Chinese Communist Party teaches. It's the same religion that the regime in Tehran is pushing. It's the same religion that the regime in North Korea is pushing. All of these things are very common. It's just that social justice theory, critical race theory, applied postmodernism has been put into the language matrix of the West in a way that gives it credibility. It's made out to be science when in reality it's anti-science.
Well, Robert Spalding, you've been a great guest with us today, and we want to thank you for your time. It's been really insightful, and if anyone who hasn't read the book Stealth War, I thoroughly recommend it. It's an award-winning book and some incredible content on there, so I do thoroughly recommend it. And thank you for your time, Robert. It's been hugely insightful.
Thank you. It's great talking to you.